In this lecture series, we'll be looking at some of the living aspects of the Earth and how they function. The book focuses on a case study of the Biosphere 2 project down in the Arizona desert. And in that, scientists and engineers tried to replicate functioning living Earth systems and do so under controlled environments. The purpose was to study basic ecosystem science, but also with applications to colonization of other planets, climate change adaptation, and for a variety of purposes. But the question comes, to what extent can we control, replicate, and engineer Earth's living systems alongside our efforts to try and manage its physical systems, such as controlling rivers through dams or other physical works. So you should be reading Chapter 6 for this first few sections of the lecture on ecosystems and nutrient cycling. So I would direct you to the book, and again, I'm required that you read the book more closely during this unit to determine what, in detail, Biosphere 2 is and what it represented as an experiment. But for our focuses, it's going to be here more on the general biosphere of the Earth's natural systems. So what is the biosphere? It's the total area on Earth where living things are found. So obviously large places in Antarctica or the Greenland ice sheets don't have much in the way of living systems other than transient animals perhaps, or certain algae and things that may grow on the snow. But for the most part, the Earth system has multiple different ecosystems, and we'll talk about those. So of the different types of ecosystems, we find a variety of categories or like groupings that we'll find repeatedly throughout the Earth. Oceans, as you're familiar with, are the most common because they cover the largest portion of the Earth's surface. Coastlines are a transition between that oceanic surface and the land surface. You'll have total tidal systems and tidal pools and such. Inland, you'll find grasslands and shrublands, and this would be common if you were going, say, from the ocean to the coast, inland, say, in Southern California. And of course, there are large-scale and various types of forests, whether they be temperate, coniferous forests, or other tropical systems. You can also find deserts that come in a wide variety of different types, depending on their location and influences and proximity to the coast. You can have freshwater aquatic systems, lakes, ponds, rivers, and flowing waters, especially in streams and upland systems. All of these are different examples or types of natural ecosystems. In contrast, humans have, over their recent past, over the last 10,000 years or so, contributed to two major types of ecosystems that humans manage and heavily influence. One is farmlands, whether they be row crops, or essentially artificial forests through orchards. And then, of course, there are the urban and suburban areas, which have their own characteristic physical and living systems. Within each of these ecosystems, there are several different components or properties. Species are those individual groups of animals that have common attributes, and more importantly, they have the ability to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So if two different animals, say for example, were able to mate, but couldn't provide or couldn't produce a fertile offspring, then those would be considered individual distinct species. A population is all members of the given species in a particular area. So you could have a bird population of, say, seagulls living in a certain area that would constitute the same species, perhaps the seagulls further up or down a coastline, but would be, if they stayed in close proximity to a given area, then that would be a local population. A biological community is populations of all species that interact in a particular area. So again, all of the birds, all the plants, all the animals, and so on, living in a particular forested region would be its biological community. And then an ecosystem, a term we've used and now we'll define a little bit more specifically, is the biological community, or the biotic, interacting with its physical environment, or the abiotic. And these terms are used, the abiotic and biotic are used somewhat interchangeably with the other terms of biological and physical. All of these terms, and virtually every one that's noted in red on these lectures, you need to be familiar with and know the definitions of, and be able to give an example of. So if you have a given ecosystem, in this case a forested system up on the east side of the Sierra Nevada, what determines that particular ecosystem is a forest and not a desert or grassland or some other form of biological community? And it's the combination of its physical environment coupled with the location that will determine what sort of biological system develops. So ecosystem formation is a function of the abiotic environment, and typically moisture and temperature. So the amount of rainfall that provides moisture to the land surface and the temperature characteristics will predict what sort of plant regime you get. In this case, if you get a particularly moist climate, then you'll get a forest as opposed to, say, a grassland or a desert. And depending on the temperature, you'll determine what type of forest it is, whether it's a conifer forest or a deciduous forest or so on. And in the plant community, largely predicts the animal community or the animal populations present, and that's determining whether on predators, say for example, you would have a lynx, maybe at a colder climate, or a bobcat in a more temperate situation. So the physical system really sets the basic controls on what sort of biological communities will occur in a given area, and ultimately what ecosystem will be established and persist. So again, the book shows you in a diagrammatic form the biosphere at the largest scale, the global scale, is all of the local, all aspects of the Earth's surface and things that live on it. A biome, which we're going to come back to in a little bit more detail, is a larger regional portion of the biosphere with similar groupings of characteristics and biological communities. Within the biome, you'll have characteristic ecosystems. The ecosystems will be comprised of communities. The communities, again, are all of the populations of plants and animals and so on. And then within the population, you can have individual members of that particular species. So there's a continuum here from the global scale down to the individual that describes where we or any organism fits into the scheme of things. So now we turn to the question of how the biosphere functions. And again, the living portions of the Earth have two very fundamental processes. They engage and support energy flow and also nutrient cycling. And we'll consider each of these. Energy flow is driven by, ultimately, the incoming energy inputs and electromagnetic radiation coming in from the sun. Thus, the Earth, as a global system, is open to energy from space, incoming solar radiation and outgoing losses of terrestrial radiation that leave the Earth and its atmosphere and bleed off into space. But from a material or a matter point of view, the Earth is largely closed. We get the odd meteor or perhaps, for geologic time, an asteroid strike, but the amount of mass and matter added to or subtracted from the Earth is negligible from the standpoint of the total mass of the Earth. So the Earth is open with regard to energy, but closed with regard to matter or materials. And the various elements or nutrients or physical matter components that we have on the Earth cycle in and out of various processes. Communities and ecosystems contain both matter, and in that we distinguish largely the term biomass, which is the weight of all living material, and a trophic level, which we'll define in a moment. And then they also, again, another important thing they do is pass energy through the ecosystem as well. And that's done through this notion of a trophic level. These are feeding levels within a food chain. So going back to early days of your science education, you probably learned about food chains and food webs, where we get our nutrition, where different plants and animals consume one another, and so on. And this gives rise to a food chain. And so matter and energy pass through that process, and we refer to that as different feeding levels or trophic levels. Together, these terms come together in what's called an ecological pyramid. And this is just a schematic and a conceptual way to describe how matter and energy transfer through a given ecosystem. So if we think about it, with plants as producers and then animals primarily as consumers, which of the levels in this pyramid do you think is occupied by green plants? Largely, it's the first. Okay, so energy comes in from the sun, it's converted through photosynthesis within plants, and then the greatest biomass and the greatest amount of total energy present is going to be in the bottom of the pyramid at level 1, and these will be your producers. Herbivores, animals that eat the plants, will be the primary consumers, and there'll be fewer of them biomass-wise and energetically. And then the predators that eat the cows, and so on, up to the third order, and anything 3 and above is considered a third order consumer, and those would be the top of the food chain, and in this case, in the modern era, largely humans, since nothing typically eats us. So if we talked about trophic levels, so in each step of those, there's a transfer. So again, the producers are the plants, and if you remember from calories and food energy representation, for 10,000 kilocalories at the producer level, when the herbivores consume that, what's left, what they contain as a result of their consumption, metabolism, loss of waste energy and such, they would that would be reduced by several orders of magnitude down to 100 kilocalories. And then the second order consumers eat the primary consumers, and then you're down from 100 kilocalories to 10. And then finally, the third order consumers have only 1 kilocalorie from the standpoint of their total energy presence. So there's a passing of energy through the system that ultimately reduces the amount at each stage of the trophic level. So this trophic level, again, reflects the flow of energy through this ecosystem. And then, again, there's a diagram in the book, and these are fairly typical, relating producers, mainly plants, and consumers in the form of food chains and food webs. And these should be reviewed for you from somewhere in your science training, and I'd encourage you to review these. This concludes the first section of our lecture. We'll move on now to part 2. Now we turn our attention to a way of categorizing different types of ecosystems and living systems on the Earth. That's the notion of a biome. This is a distinctive type of ecosystem that's characterized by occurring at a much larger scale, say at if not a continental scale, a near continental large region of the Earth. There may, even in the large area, be sub-components, different ecosystems present within that. For example, you can have an aquatic ecosystem of a running river or stream in the middle of a desert. Think in terms of the Colorado River flowing through the desert biome of the Southwest. So again, a biome will have a distinctive or characteristic set of ecosystems in it. It's going to be determined largely by climate. Recall from the last section that we said that the formation of a given ecosystem is governed by the moisture and temperature regime there. So the amount of rainfall and the array of temperatures are largely what define the climate, and ultimately the climate controls the development of biological communities. And then we identify and categorize these ecosystems into biomes based on predominant vegetation and other organisms that are adapted to those largely climatic conditions with influences of soil, topography, and geology. So these are the biomes that we see on the Earth, which are important from the standpoint of thinking of how the whole Earth interacts. So how many and what types of biomes are there on the planet? They can be organized largely into three types. As we noted earlier, you can have terrestrial, marine, and freshwater. And then within each of these larger categories, there are different subgroups depending on mainly the plant communities present. So typically you'll see a diagram of something like this, which shows temperature on the y-axis and the vertical axis, ranging from 0 to cold or above and warmer below. And then on the horizontal or x-axis, you'll be going from drier to the left, typically, and wetter to the right. And so, as you might imagine, the tropical rainforest will have the highest temperatures and the highest rainfall, whereas the tundra, the Arctic conditions and Antarctic conditions, or mainly Arctic, will have the coldest temperatures, and you may be surprised to realize that the tundra is largely a desert from the standpoint of getting very little active rainfall. And then the desert systems that you're typically familiar with when you think of the term are typically warmer, although there can be cold deserts such as the Great Basin, and they get very, very, very low rainfall. In between, you'll find varying conditions of grassland, ranges of forest, and the forest type largely changing with the amount of rainfall and the temperatures that occur in that region. And again, you can find that where do you find the tundra? Where do you find the coldest systems? These are largely in the Arctic or high latitude areas, and then the equatorial regions where you'll find the tropical systems. So again, these types of diagrams relating temperature and precipitation as representations of climate are common basis for defining our different biomes that we see. So when we think for a moment on what Biosphere 2 attempted to do, was trying to capture at least a representation of the total biosphere, in that there are multiple biomes and multiple ecosystems present. They established at least three major types of biomes, and the rainforest, an ocean system with some savanna nearby, and then a desert, coupled to human habitat or a human ecosystem, and then agricultural ecosystem as well. So they tried to have multiple aspects, multiple biomes in the natural world present under controlled conditions in order to mimic their interaction. And then it's interesting that because of the role of the atmosphere to try to keep a completely controlled, constrained environment, they actually established a lung structure that allowed variations of air pressure and gas exchange coming out of these various systems. So this was probably one of the most complex engineered structures ever built from the standpoint of trying to create and manage living replicas of very complex systems within the Earth. And what they learned is that as the more complexity you represent in a system, the greater the interactions and the further addition of complexity that grows in. So when you compare the natural biosphere with the Biosphere 2 representation, the Earth system, the natural biosphere, is global scale and extremely complex, massively so, with multiple different biomes and transitions among them that all can affect its overall function. Biosphere 2, in contrast, was a very small system. While it had interacting multiple biomes, but it was only about 3 acres in size. And one of the bigger challenges was to create the interface or the connection between them from the standpoint of natural transitions that occur on the Earth over large areas now had to be constrained to junctions and connections between different elements of the structure. So it's very difficult to downscale a planetary set of biomes into a 3-acre parcel and then connect everything in a way that mimics the real world. But it was a worthy attempt. So when you think about the biomes, they can have similar processes going on in terms of nutrient cycling, energy flow, but they have very different sets of species present. So comparing a desert to a forest, again, both have similar functions in the general sense as processes go, with photosynthesis, energy transfer among trophic levels, and so on. Yet the plant and animal communities present in the desert versus a forest are quite different in their makeup and diversity. And this is mainly because within each biome, the different environmental conditions lead to adaptations from the species present. And it's those adaptations that make them uniquely adapted and allow them to thrive and persist. When you think of temperature, for example, and you have an organism, it's going to have a range of conditions to where the organism thrives and ones where it becomes stresses, whether due to heat or to the cold. The example here with butterflies, or you could do the same with tomato plants or other species you might be fairly familiar with, there's a temperature size, probably a moderate temperature, where that particular factor has the least stress and the most favorable conditions for their ability to function, to fly, seek food, grow, reproduce. But as the temperature gets colder, those metabolic and food finding processes become more difficult or hotter. And so when you go out of that optimum range in the center of the range of this chart, you'll find zones of stress. And then when it gets very cold, say freezing conditions, or very hot, high temperature, the butterflies in this example simply cannot survive. So this gives rise to the notion of a range of tolerance. And this is the range of the limiting factor within which the species can survive, thrive, and reproduce. Okay? So the limiting factor is, in this case, the temperature, because temperature obviously places some fundamental constraints on where the butterfly in this example can survive. Now, the limiting factor itself can be then defined as some critical resource or condition whose availability or conditions itself may determine the species, population size, and its distribution. So again, temperature is a very common and hopefully familiar one in terms of where plants or animals can survive. Without the advent of technology, if you had humans as just pure animals, we couldn't survive in the Arctic. We're better at heat adaptation, but there are limits in the higher latitudes to where humans lacking fur or other physiological adaptations cannot survive. We surmount that as technological beings by prehistorically the adoption of furs or other clothing to provide insulation and warmth and to enable us to inhabit cold places. And largely, like I say, we're better adapted and more closely equipped to handle warmer climates. And so either where we humans began as a species was closer to tropical systems, and our adaptation of that is, like I say, is more favorable. But it's this notion of limiting factors and the range of tolerance determines which organisms can persist and reproduce in a given location in relation to the climate, the temperature, and the moisture. Another note about environmental controls, an example from the desert southwest in California. The tolerance limits and the limiting factors can play out differently at different life stages, as you might imagine. The desert pupfish is a very, very unique type of fish that occurs in these small, isolated pools and ponds east of Death Valley. And their ability to tolerate very harsh temperature conditions is different from the juvenile stage versus the adult. Adults can survive from essentially just above freezing, where the liquid water is down around 0 degrees, up to the very hot summer temperatures of 42 degrees C. As you might expect, the juveniles, the youngest fish, have a much more limited range of temperatures that they can tolerate, largely in the intermediate ranges between 20 and 36 degrees C. And so their birth and early development has to occur in those intervening seasons to where the temperatures are moderated to some degree. And you can picture this probably with human babies who can't thermoregulate, say, in their first 6 months and have to be especially cared for. And then as their physiological systems grow and develop, then they're able to thermoregulate and withstand heat and cold much better. So environmental controls and the range of tolerance and the limiting factors play out both at the juvenile stage, as far as reproductive success or post-reproductive success, all the way up through the survival and reproduction of the adults. This concludes our second section of the lecture. You should continue now with part 3. In this section, we consider one of the major features or properties of biomes, and that's the extent to which they cause nutrients to cycle through the environment. Ultimately, Biosphere 2 failed to reach its promise of a self-sustaining, complex, managed representation of the natural biosphere. The reasons for its failure were centered on failures within the structure and its system's ability to replicate major nutrient cycles. These nutrient cycles govern the movement of nutrients and virtually all elements, such as carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and so on, through both the abiotic and biotic components of an ecosystem. For any given nutrient, it may be present in a biotic reservoir, and that can include things like the producers, the plants, for example, animals, such as various levels of consumers, and then, of course, the decomposers, the things that eat the waste material and the dead and decaying plants and animals in the soil predominantly. So elements can move internally, and nutrients can move internally among those different levels, as we saw when we talked about food webs and the different trophic levels. But they can also pass into abiotic reservoirs, such as the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, or solid rock and soil parts of the earth, and then internally within that, and then likely at some point be returned back to the biological systems of the biotic reservoirs. So there's a very complex but connected relationship between abiotic and biotic systems with regard to how nutrients and elements cycle on the earth. An example from the carbon cycle: with the input of light and radiant energy, plants are able to conduct photosynthesis, wherein they take carbon dioxide and the carbon that's in residence in the atmosphere, which is abiotic, through the biological process of photosynthesis and are stored as biomolecules, and then through cellular respiration, the producers predominantly, and some consumers, or all consumers, will pass that carbon back into the atmosphere into the form of CO2. Energy will pass into use and application of living systems as far as their growth and reproduction, repair and pass through the system and eventually given off as waste heat. But the carbon, just in this simple example, moves from the abiotic environment of the atmosphere through plants and animals and then back to the atmosphere, going from the abiotic to biotic and back to the abiotic atmosphere. So at the larger scale, when you think about an ecosystem or a biome, this plays out globally in ways that we're very dependent on for the maintenance of living systems, but also dealing with the consequences of human intervention, modification, and damage to these processes from the standpoint of changing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere that's contributing to climate change. This will be the subject of our next lecture. The carbon cycle itself, though, has the respiration, photosynthesis we talked about, but then it also has internal subcycles through the biological system, through consumption, through decomposition, but then ultimately cycling back to the atmosphere. Just as carbon cycles, so does nitrogen, through different processes, but again, both involving the physical, abiotic and biotic systems, to where certain types of nitrogen, which can't be used in its native N2 form, can be converted through nitrogen fixation into a plant usable compound and then taken up as a major nutrient to form plants. Plants consumed by animals who contribute waste and either feed other consumers, and the waste is decomposed and cycled back through the soils and then back into the plants. The plants create litter fall, which cycles internally. And then ultimately, there are some soil processes such as denitrification that cause a certain amount of nitrogen to go back into the atmosphere into N2 form. And those processes are mediated or controlled by microbes in the soil. And then likewise, with soil erosion, both natural and human enhanced, there's going to be a loss of nitrogen from the terrestrial into the ocean, and then that will enter in ultimately into sediments and become of the rock or lithosphere program or system. Phosphorus, likewise, has very similar cycling between the abiotic and the biotic systems. It's also very tied up in soils and transferred from terrestrial to oceanic systems, which ultimately then get bound up into the soil and rock systems. So all of these nutrient cycles are very important from the standpoint of keeping the availability of major nutrients that plant communities and ultimately animals such as humans rely on, but at the same time are constantly being transferred from one biotic reservoir or abiotic reservoir to another. So to look at the Biosphere 2 example, the one interpretation is that the problem is that while plants and animals were normally conducting photosynthesis and cellular respiration, the soil system was not in balance, and it ended up taking out more oxygen than the plants can replace, such that the artificial soils, as they evolved, had to populate with microbes, and those became something of a net sink and ultimately affected both the oxygen cycle and some of the other nutrient cycles as well. So again, it's very difficult to take and manage the highly complex systems of soil, vegetation, and lower atmosphere and control and replicate those from a starting point without having enough time and certainly enough space in order for those systems to function in anything resembling their natural capacity. And as we noted earlier, human activities interfere with a number of the major nutrient cycles that commonly occur in the biosphere and that we rely very heavily on. Examples include deforestation, which reduces the amount of standing plants that can take up carbon from the atmosphere, take up carbon from the atmosphere and store it into long-term biological reservoirs. Burning fossil fuels takes carbon stored in deep geologic environments that are normally not associated with the short turnover atmosphere, and then releasing large quantities of that nitrogen, or carbon and nitrogen, back into the atmosphere. Other cycles that have been interfered with are through agriculture, both in terms of animal waste and fertilization. And what these do is these rearrange and transport phosphorus and nitrogen such that they are no longer limiting in some cases, but if they're used in excess, then they may be transferred to waterways and create artificial algal blooms and dead zones. So what are our lessons? The main ones are that the ecosystems that comprise the biosphere are very complicated and very difficult to replicate, manage, and control, and that the biosphere itself, because of that complexity and the difficulty of controlling it, is largely irreplaceable. The one thing one could argue that for the large amounts of money that were invested in Biosphere 2 that was wasted. However, I think it can also be argued that the lessons we learned in building and operating and ultimately seeing why Biosphere 2 failed taught scientists a lot about how important processes in the soils and their connection with the standing vegetation and such function, and can help us examine damaged areas and lead to their more effective restoration. And the lessons that Biosphere 2 failed to be a situation where we could readily engineer and control Earth systems involving living communities was, I think, should be a lesson that we have to acknowledge the value of and rely more on natural systems and not so much on technological optimism, that ultimately we can fix problems by replicating living systems and managing them in an artificial way. In this section, we consider a major issue with regard to ecosystems and ecosystem management in the modern world, and that being the notion of biodiversity and its loss. One of the things the book tries to do repeatedly in virtually every chapter is to provide, somewhat intuitive at least, and everyday examples of why these issues matter. And they focus on the medicinal values we gain from the wide diversity of plants that exist in the earth. And they go through a large number of different plants that are important from the standpoint of our use in medicine. And these plants are important also for healthcare to local communities in rural and indigenous, at least reasonably indigenous still places, as well as modern industrial medicine. At the commercial level, it's estimated that medicinal plants can be worth $100 billion as recently as 2011. So we're talking about very practical value here to a wide variety of plants that may not be recognized about being for value for their own sake, but have some use we're interested in. And it's estimated that 50% of all prescription drugs were originally derived from some plants, including things as common and as long-term as in use as even simple aspirin. The question is, with the wide variety of diseases, illnesses, and even the emergence of new diseases and conditions and environmental problems, environmental health effects, how many more are left to be discovered? And if there are useful plants out there that can treat a disease, or even so far as to cure or treat some form of cancer, will the plant still exist from the standpoint of threats to their loss in ecosystems undergoing some form of development? This is related to another area of interface of science and medicine called ethnobotany, and anthropology studies as how different cultures use plants in their local environment, whether they be for health effects, for nutrition, for treatment of all manner of diseases. And then oftentimes, these ethnobotanical studies and surveys that are made, especially in tropical areas where evidence of the medicinal value of plants is first uncovered and then brought back into laboratories and evaluated from the standpoint of Western medicine. The mamala tree in Samoa has been discovered to help relieve symptoms of hepatitis C, which is a very serious disease and also one that's very difficult to control. And it's simply an extract of these leaves that was discovered through the indigenous use of Samoans for other health purposes. So our notion of biodiversity is defined as or described as a measure of simply almost a count of all the different plant and animal and microbial species in an area, or if you want to talk about global biodiversity, at the Earth scale. So you can have diversity at the genetic level within a given organism, how many different gene property or genetic properties are present. You can have species diversity in terms of the variety of species present, and then in terms of the ecological diversity that includes not only the organisms and their communities themselves, but of the conditions, the habitats, the relationships between species. And collectively, this system is, this term of biodiversity reflects all of these. So it's the total measure of differences and unique species present in a given area. So how many species are there in the world of all the different organisms that we're at least aware of to date? And the simple answer is we keep finding new species on a regular basis and simply don't know. Of the roughly 1.8 million species that have been identified to date, it's estimated there could be even 100 million still left to be discovered for the different tropical systems that are very hard and only recently even begun to be explored, and to other remote areas and simply just environments to where scientists have not investigated yet. An example would be a lowly creature of the nematode, one that feeds on microbial systems, is well known in marine systems, but as of maybe a decade ago had largely been completely unexplored in freshwater systems. So we simply have no firm notion of how many species there are, but the rate at which we discover new ones suggests that there are still many, many, many more species to be identified. And in many cases, in the example of plants, there could be very significant health values and medicinal values to be identified as well. And it's interesting that when you look at the various inhabitants of the earth, plant and animal and decomposer, it's the smallest organisms that are the most abundant in terms of their total numbers. There are, and in terms of just the number of species present, there are many, many, many insects, about 1 million known species, and based on that number, up to another 5 million that might exist that we haven't encountered yet. The same with fungi and bacteria. Tremendous numbers likely to exist based on the numbers we found and the rate at which new ones are discovered, especially the smaller the organisms. So with all this diversity, let's return now just for a moment to the notion we introduced earlier with natural capital and natural interest and the ecosystem services and their worth to humans. So if we looked at all those different organisms and say even all those medicinal plants, not to mention waste recycling, water processing, all that, if we had to pay for all those services and do those artificially, assuming we could, what would it cost human society as a trade-off to what we essentially get for free by deriving value from intact functioning ecosystems? The estimates are as much as a $33 trillion. This amount of money is so large as to be largely incomprehensible, but it gives you a sense of the fact that we have so much value from these different organisms that there's economic value to be gained from maintaining the organisms and the ecosystems they depend on in order to survive. So the larger suite of ecosystem services we've talked about are varied in their type, whether they be from cultural providing cultural benefits, whether providing direct resources needed for basic survival, such as food and fiber, fuel, pharmaceuticals. And then in terms of the different environmental systems that can be regulated by natural systems, such as nutrient cycling, air and water purification, flood control, and so on. So again, when you think of all these different elements, you have to take an ecosystem view of the ensemble of all the different goods and services we gain from ecosystems. And again, going back to the a book example, it's estimated that about 80% of the tropical forests of biodiversity that have been identified on Samoa and the medical cures that have been derived from those forests has been lost due to deforestation and human development. So what did we lose with that 80% reduction of what we might have gained for some of these other benefits? This is especially concerned when we talk about the future of ecosystems, and especially tropical ecosystems, which are under enormous and increasing pressure with growing populations and with developing countries' desire to increase their economic standard of living. So biodiversity conservation is a tremendously important area of environmental concern and management, and also one which has a wide array of job and professional opportunities in the future, especially in Europe, in places where this has been recognized due to the very limited number of natural systems still functioning in Europe, where long human habitation has modified most parts of the natural environment there. This concludes the fourth part of our lecture. Please continue on now with the final section. In this final section of the lecture, we'll look at some of the current practices and opportunities to conserve biodiversity. One concept that's important, and term that's regularly used, is the notion of endemism. And this refers to plant and animal species that exist only at one location on the earth. So endemic plants are ones that only occur, say, in the Central Valley of California, or on the north coast of California, or in the northern Great Basin, or the southern tip of Florida, or someplace like that. And with the presence of multiple endemic species, there's the notion of biodiversity hotspots. And these are areas, or specifically regions, that contain large numbers of endemic and threatened species, species that may be lost to extinction if they're eradicated from a given location and totally. So biodiversity hotspots and endemism are closely linked notions in terms of how we identify areas and species that are of importance to be maintained. If you look at a map of the biodiversity hotspots on the planet in your textbook, you'll find that there are, mostly in the tropical regions, which is not surprising given the large array of large numbers of species that can occur with ample moisture and plenty of warmth and solar radiation. But the Pacific Northwest and the west coast of the United States is another area that has a large amount of biodiversity left intact, since it's still relatively, there are a lot of places where endemic species especially occur and have yet to, and still survive. Likewise, there are oceanic regions, areas of large biodiversity in ocean systems and coastal systems that occur, and all of these have been identified as important areas to conserve endemic species and other species that are threatened with extinction. Extinction, as the complete elimination of a species, may be familiar to you. There's also the notion of extirpation. And this can occur when a species goes extinct in one region but still survives and is present somewhere else, whether it be a bat or an endangered plant or such. And it's possible to reintroduce that organism back into part of its former range if possible. And you can see examples of this with efforts to reintroduce wolves back into parts of the Intermountain West, because they're largely hunted out and reduced down to very small populations in zoos. But through captive breeding, there have been some successful reintroduction of wolves into parts of the Rockies and even into Northern California and Southern Oregon. But they face a lot of pressure from local farming and ranch interests who view them as threats to livestock. But reintroduction is valuable from the standpoint of having a living organism to regain part of its normal range and habitat. The book provides this chart of the distribution by taxonomic group of different endangered species. The tan bar is the percent of known species that's listed as threatened or endangered, and the green bar is the estimated size of that group in terms of total. So as you might imagine, perhaps given our earlier lectures, that vertebrates are the smallest grouping as a percentage of all the organisms on the earth. But when you look at the total number of those the class of taxonomic class of organisms, there's a very large number of vertebrates that are threatened or endangered. And this is exceeded by plants, which has a larger number of total species, but a very high percentage of those, maybe pushing up to 50%, is considered threatened or endangered. Insects, there's large numbers of them. They're probably not, most of them aren't identified yet, and the number that are threatened with listed or endangered species is very small. So it varies quite a bit in terms of the sensitivity of these different groups to the type of disturbances seen today. But there are a lot of species at risk, and we're in an era of one of the greatest extinctions, or numbers of extinctions, since the end of the last ice age or other extinction events. In the United States, in 1973, the Endangered Species Act was passed, and that, by virtue of protecting species from extinction, became a modern method of protecting biodiversity, but only within the United States. And this can occur to or apply to coastal waters within the territorial waters offshore and marine systems, and throughout the terrestrial environment of the United States. So how do we conserve biodiversity where it still exists? There are a couple of major practices or conceptual approaches. One is to take a single species approach, and that is to emphasize their protection as a species. Salmon, polar bears, any of the wolves, any of the major, and oftentimes the larger predators are the most common, but these are typically ones that there is widespread public support for protection and maintenance of their population. Pandas are another example, eagles, and so on. There have been, in the case of like the California condor, a large predatory bird, scavenger bird that almost went extinct, was down to just a small number of individuals. Through successful captive breeding, has been reintroduced to parts of its range in Southern California, but it still faces a lot of pressure due to conflicts with humans in developments, active subdivisions, conflicts with ranchers and such. And so it's, while back in the wild, it's certainly not anywhere near the numbers that once existed, because as a high order predator, there were simply very few condors to begin with. But beyond these very attractive organisms, or plants and animals that readily attract public support, what about all the others that are going extinct or threatened with extinction? For that, an alternative approach has been developed, and that's referred to as an ecosystem approach. And in that case, there's more of a focus on protecting an area, and in turn, the ecosystem within that area, in which case then a wide variety of species at different levels of the trophic systems, or species that may not be even identified yet, can be protected as well. So again, you gain the value of multiple species protection and the fact that they're allowed to continue their natural interaction and the ecological function of the ecosystem is maintained. And this is where it's this ecosystem approach that uses the biodiversity hotspot notion as a basis for identifying areas to acquire and protect land areas, or identify areas for treaty protection of marine systems. So there are a variety of different ways to protect and conserve biodiversity. The book lists many of those. It's important to simply monitor biological systems to understand what their condition is, what the status of their populations are, and so on. And then there are a variety of different planning processes. And more recently, you're seeing efforts to restore and remediate damaged areas, try and bring back proper functioning. And in some cases, this has been informed by lessons learned from Biosphere 2. But other emergent areas, this I think is one of the exciting new areas in science to look into, in environmental science, is the effort to try and heal damaged places and the biological systems that they support. And then almost by luck, or at least good fortune, the notion of the national park system and wilderness areas and other forms of reserves, those, especially the park system and the wilderness areas that really very strictly limit any human use, have, by side effect, if you will, protected large areas as intact ecosystems, to where the natural populations can be maintained and interact as they did originally. So there's the aesthetic and recreational side of the national parks, for example, but there's also the biodiversity conservation aspects as well. And then there are a wide variety of laws and treaties that have been and will continue to be developed to protect biodiversity, both for practical reasons, but also for based on an ecological worldview, to try and protect systems for their own sake and to maintain global biodiversity as well. And that brings the question is, how do you engage developing nations to care about areas to maintain intact forest systems, as opposed to harvest them for timber and conversion to, say, for food production, either through agriculture or through grazing. And there are a variety of different programs and efforts involved in that. One example is the Debt for Nature swap, and that's where, through nonprofit pressures, the United States government, the World Bank, and other European financial institutions have agreed to forgive all or parts of the foreign debt for countries if they will preserve significant portions of their natural areas. So the developing country gains economically without having to extract or completely modify or diminish its ecosystem resources. So recall the case study from the mala tree. It's, in addition to its other values, it also produces a compound called prostratin, which is important from the standpoint of treating HIV. And there have been some efforts with the mamala tree to undertake captive breeding programs and extensions of the tree. And the U.S., again, looking to the industrial approach, has attempted to find the synthetic versions of this chemical. And this may lead to a whole class of chemicals that may be useful for HIV or their immune system diseases. And in order to make this work financially and to encourage protection of the tree within Samoa or in comparable places, there's the profit-sharing approach. And that the local communities receive 50% of all the royalties from the sale of prostatin through the pharmaceutical companies. So there are a variety of ways to where ecosystems can provide services and goods that benefit not only developed countries, in the case of the medicinal values derived, but also reinvesting in the local communities, which are critical to the maintenance of the species and the community that supports that species in these, especially these tropical environments. And this brings us to, in conclusion then, to the question of how do we motivate modern society with its focus on the digital age, the benefits of modern society, and we aren't really well connected to natural systems on a daily basis, rarely almost anymore. And so how do you motivate the public to support biodiversity conservation? And the quote here focuses on the notion that if you can show potential medical benefits, health benefits, or other tangible goods and drugs that may benefit modern society, then you can help motivate that society to support protection of areas and maintenance of intact ecosystems and restoration. In general, we have, again, enormous value residing in the remaining populations and species still to be discovered. We simply need to recognize that and to make sure that we don't lose something before we realize it's there. This concludes our final section of this lecture. Should continue on and complete the quiz.